I don't want to put spittle over my Bible, man. That'd be kind of gross. I don't want my Bible to get COVID. All right, just waiting for that thumbs up. All right. Good afternoon, church. My name is Eli. I'm a member of the Mountain Church, and I'm a part of a preaching cohort where we're going through how to give sermons, and we're kind of doing some practices on how to do that. We're going through 1 Kings chapter 2. As of last week, we were looking at 1 Kings chapter 1, and Adonijah, the eldest son of David, just tried to essentially usurp the throne, not according to God's will, but of his own. And he just tried to steal the throne from David due to his old age. He wasn't able to really fight back due to the fact that he was sick. But God's provision shone through, and Solomon was ultimately proclaimed king, and Adonijah's usurpation was foiled. And now we're going into, as Solomon is king, David is dying, and he's giving his words of advice and some rather really cold-blooded things to say, some advice as well to give Solomon as he's continuing his throne, and kind of giving warnings about who could cause potential problems. And we'll see what comes of that later in the chapter. But going through verses going back to 1 through 4, David is dying, and on his deathbed, he's giving Solomon some words of advice. He's saying, listen, follow the Mosaic law. Follow what God is saying. Stay true to it, for you will prosper in this way. Straying from that path will cause tons of problems, as we've seen previous kings do, and as we've seen previous people do, and as David has done. David has done himself, and he's saying, Solomon, stay true to the Mosaic law. Stay true to God's way. Follow what he is saying. And kind of one thing that comes out of this that I kind of want to focus in on, and we'll go into this later, but it's God keeps his promises. And that's something I just want to keep in the back of your mind as we're going through this passage and we're really diving in. It's something that you're going to see prevailing throughout this entire chapter. But as he says, follow the Mosaic law to Solomon, he later then kind of gives a little bit more darker things to say and talks about two particular people, Joab and Shimei, and saying that these men have hurt the kingdom, they have betrayed me, and they will cause problems for yourself. But I deem you as wise, and you should deal with these as you see fit. But these are the reasons why these people will cause problems for you. And he kind of hints that he should send them to Sheol, which is the Jewish way of saying hell, which is kind of dark. and then we go into verses 10 through 12, and it's a bit of a pause. You think that you want to go back towards what Solomon does in spite of this advice that was given to David, but it really shows the death of David. This is the death of a major historical and biblical figure, and it's kind of a pause. And why would the Bible really pause and really highlight his death? Well, he was a great man and a man after God's own heart, but he also was a liar, adulterer, cheater, murderer, and he strayed from God's path all the time. But what is different about David to everybody else? Well, I kind of say that he did the wrong things right. He was quick to realize his wrongdoings, and he was quick to ask for forgiveness and bend the knee. He was quick to say, God, I have failed you. How can I move forward? And he was repentant. And not only that did he see his wrongdoings, but he turned away from them immediately. And is one of the reasons why I think that God really it was a man after God's own heart. He turned away. And this is paying homage to that man, that major biblical figure, as saying that this is a great man, and he is now dead. An end of an era for Israel, and what is going to be happening moving forward with his son, Solomon. Moving into Solomon, it kind of hits in multiple fashions that his reign is being established. And Adonijah, who was the oldest son and tried to usurp the throne, tries it one last time, one last Hail Mary, one last try to go for the throne. And what does he do? Well, he goes to Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon, and says, I would like to take this woman, sorry, I'm trying to find her, Shagatha, I believe her name is, or Abishag, my bad, Abishag as my wife. Now, who is Abishag? Abishag was the nurse, or rather one of the wives of David, not necessarily in a sexual way, but of a way to help him in his old age because he was sick. She was actually known as a wife to David. or implied. And one of the things in old Arab customs was that if you in fact had sex or you in fact married another king's wife, you had stake in that throne. You had stake to the throne. You could say, I am staked to the throne because I'm married to this woman and I want the throne. Notice that Adonijah is completely turning away from God's will and completely doing his own thing. He's saying, I want this because I was denied it and it's mine. I want the throne. And so he's asking through Bathsheba to go to Solomon to ask for this. Well, Bathsheba says yes and goes to Solomon and says, Adonijah would like Abishag as his wife. And Solomon, with his wisdom, seeing that this is a stake in the throne, says immediately, no. No, what should I give you the kingdom as well? Should I just give it away? Because that will end up be happening. Well, Solomon ended up sending Benaniah, one of his enforcers and one of his close associates, and ended up putting Adonijah to death. I would find that to be a very extreme way of doing things, but there is reason for it. Adonijah was constantly going against God's will and God's established kingdom, and not only that, but he was also doing it out of his own selfish pride and will. He was sinning, and what are the wages of sin? They are death. So Solomon puts him to death. One of the eldest sons of David is now dead, but the kingdom is now established and far more secure. Going on to the next person, as we see later in verse 26, Abiathar, which is one of the high priests of the kingdom, and he also sided with Adonijah. And Solomon, in dealing with him, decides to instead strip him of his priesthood, for he not only suffered and lived with David, but he also held the Ark of the Covenant, and stripped him of it and banished him and said, you are no longer a priest. I will spare you, but you will no longer hold this title. You were done. And kind of the reason I think that he might have been spared from death itself was because he might have been repentant. He might have realized the error of his ways. But it doesn't specifically say that. That is simply an implication that I think might have happened. Now, since he was expelled, now we're moving on to Joab, the general of David's armies. This man was a warrior, a man who would fight, who would stand up and fight, and was very close to David, but he also tended to do his own thing and kind of go off on his own way. And this is coming from verse 28. He found out that Adonijah is dead, Abiathar has been expelled from the priesthood, and he's seen the dominoes fall. He's seen the fact that, well, I'm next. And so he runs at the tent of the Lord and holds into the horns, the same as Adonijah did in chapter 1, and he's trying to save himself from death because he knows that for the murders that he committed, in peacetime, his time will come. Now Benaniah, the enforcer, who's killed Adonijah, but went to him and asked him to leave, for justice must be done. It is time for justice to happen. And Joab kind of says, no, leave me alone. I'm going to stay right here. I don't want to die. I prefer to live, please. And so Benaniah, instead of just acting of his own will, goes to Solomon and says, he's at the throne. He's not at the throne. He's at the ark. He's holding the bull's horns. He's staying there. I can't kill him. What should I do? And Solomon, saying that the murders he's previously committed are on his own head. It's time. It's done. It's over. His life is forfeit. You are okay to spill the blood because, in fact, the blood that he himself has spilled is not okay. So go ahead and kill him. So he goes in the tent and kills him. His threat to the reign is now done. For Joab liked to do his own thing. He liked to go off, and he would, though faithful to David, would always try to do it his own way. He wouldn't do it according to how he was commanded, but with what he wanted. And, in fact, ended up with his demise. Now to the next person, Shimei. Shimei was given by Solomon an ultimatum. You may live, but you must live in this house in Jerusalem. If you leave it, you'll be put to death. Basically giving the condition of he's not only ending the threat to his reign and God's reign, but he's also making it so he doesn't have to spill any more blood. It's actually a rather wise move of Solomon. Now Shimei, due to the fact that two of his servants are off on some other far land, decides to go after them. Now, you'd think that maybe be a little smarter and probably just go to Solomon and say, hey, some of my servants are missing. Can you get them for me? And so he decides to do his own thing and actively disobey. And off he goes, crosses the threshold, leaves where he was not supposed to be going. And Solomon says, well, I caught you. You left where you're supposed to go. Time to be put to death. And so he is. And then it ends this chapter with, so the kingdom was established in the hand of Solomon. And actually, this little bit was said 4 times. In verse 33, it's first stated, in verse 12, it was first stated. And verse 12 saying, so Solomon sat on the throne of David his father, and his kingdom was firmly established. His kingdom was established. Verse 33, and so shall their blood come back on the head of Joab, on their head and his descendants forever. But for David and his descendants and his house and for his throne, there shall be peace from the Lord forevermore. His throne is established. Verse 45. But for King Solomon shall be blessed, and the throne of David shall be established before the Lord forever. Verse 46. And the king commanded Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, and he went out and struck him down, and he died. And so the kingdom was established in the hand of Solomon. This is said 4 different times. I think it's very specific. The kingdom was established, and this is referring to God's kingdom. God's kingdom, despite all the chaos, all the bloodshed, all the political warfare, despite all of that, his kingdom was established. His promise was kept. The line of David is secure, and we are moving on to the next kings and ultimately ends in Jesus, who not only lives out the Mosaic law to its perfection, but also sets the throne of David and sets the kingdom of God to be held forevermore, eternally. Jesus ends up doing what David and Solomon and all the other kings could not, but he lives a perfect life and does it perfectly, and ultimately, in the end, his reign's eternally given. And it's so cool to see just how God can use the chaos of this fallen world to use for his benefit, for his will. His promise is not only kept, but his will is also fulfilled. It is a beautiful thing to see. And how does this relate to God's relationship with his people? Well, despite what we may do, his will is still fulfilled. And not only that, but justice was served. God used people to use justice, and it was in his timing, not in David's timing, not in Joab's timing, not in Solomon's timing, but his timing, that justice was served. These men were not only unrepentant, but the 4 men that were showed in this text were actively sinning and not going away, not doing what David did. And David realized when he murdered someone, he tore his clothes, he fell on his knees, said, God, forgive me. These men did none of that. They simply did what they did and moved forward as nothing would happen. And this really shows that justice will be served. And then we'll move forward with question 2.